So let's talk through the Tyranids as a faction and how they're looking on the tabletop right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids. In this video I thought we'd do a rough faction overview, talking about how the Tyranids are performing in the numbers right now, a whole bunch of the standout units for the army, and talking through each detachment with some example army lists that good players have managed to do well with. Tyranids over the past year or so haven't been doing so badly in Warhammer 40K. Obviously loads of people having a good time collecting these swarms from beyond the galaxy, drawn in by a massive wave of new cool models from the start of 10th edition. Early on they were maybe a bit over-dependent on scoring shenanigans to just keep them afloat, in the face of most of the faction not really being very dangerous. The Games Workshop that gave them really quite a big rules update roughly a year ago when they brought out the Pariah Nexus cards and made a lot of their profiles a lot more dangerous. Since then they've generally tended to be fairly well balanced, around about the mid-tier of 40k, and in a position where they can punch up with people winning tournaments from them from a range of different detachments. It seems that after the latest balance updates they're maybe doing a little bit more lower mid than normal, with 46% win rates at grand tournaments, though admittedly that's only after 3 weeks worth of stats. Still kind of early days at the moment. Looking at Goonhammer's data, that includes some more casual data, they're more like their fairly standard 49% to 50%, and there is a fair bit more data there. They still seem like a solid faction that can be a massive pain to reckon with in the hands of a good player. In the first few weeks since the latest balance update, they've already won 2 grand tournaments, both of those seeming to be via the Subterranean Assault formation, and with their massive popularity, they're one of the most popular factions to play in tournaments, maybe varying around about 3rd to 5th most plays. Most people use the Invasion Fleet, then the Subterranean Assault, but most of the other detachments see play at least a little bit. I thought for this one we could talk through some of the stronger options of the Tyranids, both for units, and then focus on a whole bunch of detachments and some of the units that are more specific to them, some of the stronger options, and a few basic tactics as to how to use them. Before we start, I'll just quickly mention the channel's affiliate discount retailers down in the video description below. If there are any newer Tyranids players out there, or anyone looking to order in some bugs from beyond the galaxy, they can save a bit of money versus Games Workshop. There's a whole bunch of options listed from around the world, and anything bought through them does help to support Auspex Tactics a bit. Many thanks to anyone choosing to use those when they do happen to order in some models. First up, let's start with maybe some of the most standout units for the Tyranids. In strong lists, maybe these are some of the ones that are most likely to see some play regardless of what detachment that you're going with. So obviously there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's really quite good regardless of detachment, and I will mention those later. Here though I've chosen to list the Biovore, Hive Tyrants, the Lictor, the Exocrine and the Tyrannifex, and then some sort of Endless Multitudes units to flip objectives with some high OC. Broadly speaking, I would say that most of the Codex is usable enough. After several balance passes and some rules rewrites, most of the units at least have some draw to play casually, maybe only a few ones that are really stand out weak still. Starting out with the staples, and first up we have the Biovore. Basically every strong Tyranid list still seems to run one of these. They're still a good source of strength to the faction, and most armies in the game would choose to run one if they had one available. They're a 5 wound, toughness 6 living artillery bug, and each turn they have the option of either firing out a little bit of indirect damage or seeding spore mines, and that basically means that you get to create a whole new unit of spore mines on the board, anywhere on the battlefield within 48 inches of the Biovore and greater than 9 inches away from the enemy. Typically armies just tend to field one of these and completely solo. You can only spawn with one Biovore. The Biovore itself can lurk in the backfield and basically screen out an area, or maybe camping on the primary objective, or just being a small nuisance unit ready to do secondaries. Zoning out the home field definitely has some advantages of its own. The big advantage is usually to spawn the spore mine each turn. If you draw a secondary that needs units to be in certain places but doesn't need OC, like engage on all fronts or behind enemy lines, the Biovore might be able to auto-complete it without you sacrificing a unit, which is pretty immense. And if not, there's still plenty of use that you can get out of them. Spore mines prevent advance moves nearby to them, and it means that if you put one on an objective that your opponent needed to advance to reach, you might well be able to stop them reaching a primary objective, which could be enormous, or potentially do something like keep an advance and charge unit out of the fight, as they won't be able to advance near the mine. You could just put them down to deep strike screen other areas of the board, tuck them away in the base of ruins and things, and you could weigh this up against a bit of indirect damage if you fire the rest of your army first and hopefully destroy some enemy units. Then there might be more place to land the mines, and if there does happen to be anything that just has say 2 wounds left, you could consider using the Biovore as a Hail Mary to try and destroy it, but I definitely see that as a secondary use if you can't get some predictable value out of the mine this turn. Next up, to lead the swarm, most lists tend to use a Hive Tyrant. They changed a little bit recently, dropping down in points cost and only having the 1 free stratagem per turn, but they're still really efficient for what they do. One unit within 12 inches gets to reduce the cost of a stratagem by 1 command point. The Tyrants themselves have 10 wounds with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save, and then you've either got the winged one that can fly around faster and has a few less attacks, or the on the board one, often with a big bone sword and a venom cannon for some fire support. The winged one can debuff some melee and has the Vanguard Invader keyword, and the on-foot one has Onslaught for an aura of lethal hits and the Assault keyword, so buffs firepower nearby. Generally for these ones, people tend to run them solo, so not making use of Tyrant Guards, though I don't think they're an absolutely horrible option for the sheer amount of toughness that they have for the cost. They could allow you to play more aggressive with them. Most see them as an unnecessary luxury though, and you can hopefully get away with just keeping them on the board and playing cagey, maybe hiding out of line of sight of most enemy guns while they're buffing nearby monsters with free stratagems, and the on-foot one giving them Onslaught for faster movement and lethal hits. The lethal hits is particularly nasty with Exocrines with their sort of mid-strength profile, and for the first couple of turns it might be likely best to focus on the free stratagems that they can hand out, and then towards the end of the game, as that becomes less and less important for them to survive, you likely need to start moving them out, forcing the enemy to deal with them, and putting their damage and defense to good use. Most of the detachments can get some pretty great value from them. They're one of the best bearers of enhancements out there. Invasion fleets finds them super easy to use for 5+ feel no pain, and otherwise if they're supporting Tyrannifex and Exocrines, then even free command point rerolls on Tyrannifex guns could actually be some pretty outsized value given their stats. I'd probably be more tempted by the on-foot one personally compared with the winged one outside of Vanguard Onslaught. Next up for some standout Tyranids, we've got the Lictor, 60 points for a super cheap and efficient lone operative, and often seen in multiples in competitive lists. They're 6 wounds at toughness 6, so take a little bit of focus fire to bring down. They have fights first, they can infiltrate. They've got 6 attacks with precision at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, get a free rapid ingress, and can generate command points if they happen to destroy characters. Super cheap lone operatives in any army have some pretty awesome value. The Lictors may be slightly impressive for having a bit of okay damage threat and not being a complete pushover in terms of defense for the cost either. I feel like they're a unit that you could really vary the use of depending on the opponent. At 60 points for an infiltrate unit, they have enough value to use there. If the opponent's got some scouts and infiltrators they're really going to want to push the mid-board with, the Lictor could mean that they can't put them in that one section of the board where the Lictor's set up, as they have to keep 9 inches away. If that's not an issue, they could play a bit cagier, maybe lurking in the backfield as a unit that the opponent can't interact with at long range, potentially being ready to do actions and secondaries, screening deep strike out, and then maybe ready to counter-attack any lighter deep strikers or reserves that try and get into the backfield. Or finally, you could make use of their rapid ingress rule, seeing as they can do that for free. They'd have to turn up at the flanks of the army, but when they do, they can near enough guarantee a charge. If they deploy 12 inches away, then nothing will be able to hurt them. Then they can move 8 inches and get a 4-inch charge at least on something that might not necessarily be an optimal target. Once they are engaged and scrapping in the mid-board via any method, they've got some okay anti-space marine damage. They could bully smaller squads of objective grabbers, and potentially could threaten to throw themselves into a big unit and snipe out characters that the profile is going to be effective against. They don't really have the defense to be able to take on mainline threats and come out living though. The fights first can be a nice consolation prize as well. If melee is the only way that the opponent can catch up with them, they might at least drag down a few of their infantry before they manage to get killed. Overall, it's really hard to go too far wrong and loads of good options in any army. Before we move on with the other Tyranids units, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in ObjectiveMarkers.com. They're a UK-based maker of faction-themed objective markers for Warhammer 40K, currently shipping within the UK, though planning to expand to more global shipping soon. These bigger objective markers are pretty handy to have for 40k gaming, basically taking a little bit of the guesswork and measuring out of using objectives. So have a 40mm circle in the centre, and then the outside of the marker is basically pre-measured out the 3 inches so you can see exactly what's on the objective and what isn't. Plenty of people make designs like this, but these guys' ones are specifically tailored to try and blend in with the battlefield, basically being made of some clear silicon, so to add a bit of faction theme but not detract from the battlefield itself too much. They've got a whole bunch of different designs of them, plenty of which could be appropriate enough for your swarms from beyond the galaxy. Here's their Space Swarm one. They're typically sold in packs of 6, £25 for the 6 of them. I've got a whole bunch of different designs as well, ones for Golden Companions, Power Armoured Warriors or Hard-Better Military Forces. Some for Chaos, some Greenskins, and some for Ancient Aliens. Currently as part of their launch promo things, they've got 10 extra dice included with the marker sets for no extra cost. And they do have a few other things on sale on their store as well, such as some ruined terrain bases to clearly mark out the footprints of ruins. In any case, check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look at them, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Getting back to the Tyranids though, and next up we have the Tyrannifex, 200 points for the walking battle tank of the Tyranids, 16 wounds at toughness 12 with a 2+ save, is incredibly indomitable, and once per game you can cancel a damage when it's allocated, changing it to 0, though that is before saves are rolled, so it is maybe a little bit frustrating that you can't roll a save first. A bit of a no-brainer against certain shots though, like Tau railguns. A lot of people tend to fill these with a mighty rupture cannon, 2 shots at strength 18, AP 4 and damage d6 +6, Certainly one of the more efficient and scary forms of Tyranid anti-tank, though some people like the acid spray for burning a bunch of infantry to death in the midboard. Often being run alongside them for the more sort of anti-heavy infantry damage, we've got the Exocrine. This one gets D6 plus 3 shots at strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3 out to 36-inch range. Really quite nice for smashing enemy Space Marines or Terminator equivalents, and has enough AP and damage to punch up against tougher threats, particularly with lethal hits and invasion fleets or a nearby friendly Hive Tyrant. They can also be useful to mark targets for other things, potentially even other Exocrines, as you get reroll 1s to hit against things that they've shot. These guys are often used as some of the biggest and most efficient primary damage dealers for the Tyranids. Despite improvements, it still seems like it's one of the faction's weaknesses to be able to deal with really tough stuff. Plenty of things that are toughness 10 or more can give the faction more of a challenge than some, and as a result these guys tend to be some of the most common answers to things. As with any firepower units, they'll be wanting to be set up with good firing lanes, ideally hidden turn 1 so they're not taking damage first if you can arrange it. Obviously shoot heavy infantry equivalents with the Exocrine and tanks and vehicles with the Tyrannifex if they present themselves. The Tyrannifex can lurk really quite far back and should be quite safe versus enemy shooting. It's a massively indomitable profile to take down, particularly with cover at that range, and hopefully they should be able to brutalise the enemy's things moving forward. As with other ranged units though, it's going to be a bit of a decision as to how aggressive you are with them. They really don't want to be left for turns when they've not got anything ideal to shoot, so would have to strike the balance between keeping somewhat safe and preserving their strength for later in the game, and rushing up the board to try and draw some crucial lines of sight on enemy units advancing. The Hive Tyrant's aura could potentially help with that with Onslaught. Tyrannifexes definitely have a reputation for unreliability as well, kind of hard to rely on to do anything on any one turn with that big casino cannon, but maybe could be an alright target for command point rerolls, particularly on the wound roll, as there's such a potential high yield if you can get that wound through. Finally, for a few of the more standout units, I thought it was worth mentioning the Endless Multitudes. Often some of the most popular ones here tend to be a few small units of 10 of Hormagaunts or Gargoyles. The Termagants are perfectly usable as well. The Hormagaunts and Gargoyles are both interesting though, as they've just got good movement, either 10 inches and advance and charge, or the Gargoyles move, shoot, move. And then they've got a whole bunch of objective control where they can just swarm towards a midboard objective and just take it off the opponent for a turn, as well as maybe gumming up and blocking movement on a bunch of enemies. Sometimes they could do some okay damage against some light infantry, though in general that's really not the focus for them. They generally focus on screening it and using their OC to grab primary objectives, maybe forcing the opponent to trade units for them that they might not want to. Though I guess the Hormagaunts could be interesting enough with lethal hits from invasion fleets, plus maybe a debuff from a friendly Psychophage or similar. Those are a few of the more standout Tyranids units, but before jumping into individual detachments I thought I'd just mention the Tyranid core rules, Synapse and Shadow in the Warp. Games Workshop's generally trying to make Tyranids play as per the fluff, so lots of smaller organisms cluster around various types of leader beast or psychers directing their bare instincts. Synapse was maybe a bit more underwhelming when the Codex came out, though got better. It means that Tyranid leadership is a bit more sturdy compared with most. They test 3d6 against battle shock while within Synapse range, though we'll bear in mind that doesn't include leadership tests, and it means that if leadership tests are forced by enemy units to check effects and things, then sometimes they can be a bit more prone to fail due to a lot of the non-Synapse things being leadership 8. It does mean that isolated swarms that are testing Battleshock in the more normal way though are odds on to fail it. In the expansion last year though, it was also expanded to add +1 strength in melee. That's maybe a bit of an unreliable buff as it doesn't always translate into +1 to wound, but for some models it was really quite a big deal. Maybe things like the Norn Emissary being particularly notable. Going from strength 9 to strength 10 helps it out against a good number of common profiles like toughness 10 or toughness 5. Synapse also provides an aura of -1 leadership debuffs for the Shadow in the Warp effect as well, so enemies will be more likely to fail those tests if there's Synapse organisms nearby. Overall though, it basically means that most Tyranids lists will want at least a good number of Synapse units, as I feel like between these 3 advantages it's enough to have Synapse be an advantage that you'd want to have it on your units running around, though fortunately it's maybe not the most restrictive thing to build around, as lots of units in the army have it that are already quite good in their own way anyway. Speaking of which, the second half of their core rule is to basically cast an entire board battle shock happening once per game, and you can choose to activate it in either player's command phase. I guess in theory you could try and activate it in yours, say if the opponent has contested an objective and you want to try and allow you to score that primary instead if you both have models on it, though in general it's more common and tempting to use it sometime in the enemy's command phase. In particular, a turn where they might be holding a primary or two with just the one unit could be the best ones to go for, as that could give you a pretty reasonable chance to directly have a unit fail, and then this army rule translates very directly into a victory point swing. Due to the timing of it and stratagem restrictions, the opponent can't actually use insane bravery against this one, as it doesn't happen in the battle shock phase of the command phase, just within the bulk of it itself. Across the board you should get at least a fair few enemy units failing, provided they've not just got a very few of them. I'd probably mainly use it to focus around the objective threat, though you might also have other units fail and prevent them from using stratagems, or maybe even have to make them make decisions about desperate breakout if they're already in melee with you. Games Workshop made the Neurotyrants, the new big Zoanthrope style model from the Leviathan box set, interacts really quite heavily with both rules. It can be a particularly easy one to push Synapse out onto units that might be a bit further flung. It's got an 18-inch range of allowing 2 friendly Tyranids to channel that, and then on top of that it's got a whole board debuff from -1 to Shadow in the Warp, so potentially that's going up to -2 if they're also near a Synapse unit. Between those two, that's some pretty good advantages. You could see that as making up a good chunk of its 105 point cost, and then beyond that you've essentially got a fairly expendable, somewhat annoying to kill monster with a 4+ invulnerable save that can go around using its Psychic Scream torrent attack to melt some enemy infantry. It can be nice enough as a unit to guard the home field, perhaps particularly with a fairly punchy Overwatch with that Psychic Scream. Though some people also like to run them with Zoanthropes as well. You can potentially have them getting +1 to hit, maybe +1 to wound as well, and basically give them big guns never tire as well so they can fire in melee. Then if you want to build even further into Battle Shock and the Shadow in the Warp style shenanigans, there's also the Neurolictor. I feel like these guys might be more tempting if there's a Neurotyrant on the board. They can hand out additional Battle Shock tests, potentially from out of line of sight as well as a lone operative, so they could lurk in a ruin and then be within 12 inches of an objective and potentially stop the opponent scoring that objective if they fail. And then on top of that, they have a debuff against enemy units. If you're battle shocked within 12 inches of this guy, then you're -1 to hit, and Tyranids will be +1 to wound against that target, which is a pretty significant damage buff when you could focus a massive amount of firepower against something in range. It is a bit situational though, depending on what units actually fail, but maybe one of the best ways of actually capitalising and gaining a lot of damage and maybe even defence from a battle shock test being failed, as opposed to perhaps the slightly more tangential objective related bonuses from the core rule. Quite a lot of Tyranids lists include either one or both of these guys, though certainly not every one of them, as we'll see. Let's focus on the Tyranid detachments next though, and compared with most armies and codexes out there, I'd rate the Tyranid ones as really quite well balanced. People play a wide variety of them, both at a casual and a tournament level. There are two that seem to stick out more in terms of play rate at the moment, and that's the Invasion Fleet and the Subterranean Assault one. The Vanguard Crusher and Assimilation still have some good play, and Synaptic Nexus has some good draw as well. For some recent win rates, the vast majority of them are around about the 50% sort of mark. Probably not really too worth focusing too much on the small differences between these win rates. They might be a bit more reflective of the types of player that are choosing to play them as much as anything else. In general, people tend to have most faith that either Invasion Fleet or Subterranean Assault will do well for them in tournaments though. They are the most played. Invasion Fleet giving you some big helpful damage and defensive buffs. Subterranean Assault is the burrow and tunnel one that allows you some big movement tricks, plus some army-wide damage and potentially very close range charges. That's the one that's won the recent grand tournaments. And then Vanguard Crusher and Assimilation Swarm are all around about 50% wins as well. Quite nice to have an army where you can very credibly play all sorts of different ways and not feel too far behind the power curve of Warhammer 40K in general, at least against the average army. Let's go through the detachments though, talk through what they bring and some examples of what people have chosen to play with strong army lists for them. Invasion Fleet is the old index one, representing hyper-adaptive Tyranids overcoming any obstacle. And at the start of the game you get to either choose sustained hits against infantry and swarms, lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, or precision versus characters on critical hits, which is the lesser played choice. Fairly easy calculation there, and you can just choose whether or not it's going to be more important to take down monsters and vehicles or infantry this game, and that should very reliably add value. For stratagems, they've got a 5+ feel no pain if you're within Synapse. That's a really easy one and particularly good to use for a free one with a Hive Tyrant. There's a fights on death on a 4+ if you've got some melee troops. A consolidate 6 inches that you could wipe out an enemy unit and then tag something else potentially. Flex out a hyper adaptation for a couple of units, so maybe going for the other target that you've chosen if it makes sense. If say the opponent's just got that one infantry unit that you absolutely need to throw all the damage into. It's a particularly nice one for Endless Multitudes. If the opponent half kills a unit, you can regenerate D3+3 models potentially in 2 units within Synapse range. And there's a 2 command point one for critical hits on a 5+, again for 2 units if within Synapse. The enhancements are generally quite good as well. The Feel No Pain one is really easy to use for a Hive Tyrant, a 5+ Feel No Pain and then boosted to a 4+ if they're injured at the start of your turn. A single turn reroll for the bearer gives you some nice reliable extra damage, and the redeploys and boosted Synapse range are both usable too. Invasion Fleet often tends to want to play around the sort of staple units that we've already talked about in some combination. Here's one example of a successful army list that won a tournament called Nurgle Mania. This one's an interesting and perhaps unusually horde and infantry focused Tyranid list. There's still a good battery of 2 Exocrines and 2 Tyranofexes with Rupture Cannon, and backed up by a walking Hive Tyrant who's got quite a bit of melee threat. They'll still be able to put out some punchy firepower. Beyond that though, there's 3 big units of Hormagaunts that'll like both the lethal hits, strength 4 within Synapse, and I really enjoy the regeneration stratagems. There's a Neurotyrant and a Neurolictor pair, so plenty of battle shock flying around, and the opponent's probably going to struggle to outcompete this on primaries. There's 10 Gargoyles that can either swarm objectives or deep strike and do move shoot move things to get to unusual board positions to do secondaries. A single Biovore, a squad of melee Tyranid warriors that could be cheap enough for some Synapse and do some countercharge threat as well. And interestingly, a big unit of 10 Gene Stealers, more commonly fielded with a Broodlord. There's also a squad of 3 Raveners here. This one was before the update, and they come in units of 5. Overall, lots of typical things that can make great good use of the stratagems. Walking Hive Tyrants often tend to be a staple. This one's got the adapted biology for the feel no pain. The 3 big squads of 20 Hormagaunts are definitely one of the most interesting ones about this list though. It goes very heavy on the smaller bugs. For another slightly more recent example of a successful invasion fleet list, this one by Marco Esteban was used to take an Iberian Open tournament. A fair few similarities, though going lighter on the swarms to add more monsters in. Again, 2 Exocrines and Tyranofexes. This one also having a Mighty Norn Emissary to hold down a mid-board objective, plus a Maleceptor for some tanky Synapse and threat up front. There's 3 units of Gargoyles in place of the Hormagaunts, able to swamp objectives and again have their move shoot move shenanigans. 2 Lictor Lone Operatives, the ever-present Biovore. And then one of the more interesting choices here is a Winged Prime with 6 warriors with melee weapons. They can definitely be a big and punchy melee threat that perhaps struggle on the durability front more than most. Definitely a force to be reckoned with though, particularly with the Prime's buffs, and the Prime can range out the front. They'll certainly blend any lighter targets that they get their hands on. For the other most popular and successful Tyranid detachment at the moment though, that's the Subterranean Assault. This one's the new one on the block, only having turned up at the last balance update. It definitely feels like a spooky one to play against. The core rule's very interesting. First up, you just get 2 reroll hit rolls of 1 with literally all units at range and melee, which just being added in as an aside to a detachment rule is pretty nice really. It's not quite as impactful as Invasion Fleet against its ideal targets, but at the same time it works with everything against everything, which is rather good. Then beyond that, the idea is Tyranids bursting out of tunnels to assault the surface. Trigons, Morlocks and the Ravener datasheets have the Burrowers keyword. 2 Trigons can be characters to take enhancements, and Burrowers can arrive on the board to set up tunnel markers, then be followed from reserve by other Tyranid units that can deploy within 9 inches of a tunnel, anywhere that's outside 6 inches of an enemy. That basically means that you could have a tunneling organism turn up, lay down the tunnel marker, and then immediately be followed by friendly Tyranids that could make a 6-inch charge against the enemy. So near enough guaranteed delivery to melee if you've got a command point spare. A bunch of their stratagems are interesting enough, maybe a few highlights. Being able to essentially teleport a unit from within 9 inches of one tunnel marker to within 9 inches of another with the same rules, so you could have some massive threats suddenly swap from one side of the battlefield to the other. For when the units turn up, you can give them sustained hits 1 and ignores cover. If you've got a big scary threat just emerging from a tunnel, you can heal units, get pop-up Synapse, an aura of reroll charges, and then also return units to reserve as well, either 1 unit or 2 Burrowers, no doubt disappearing below to return to the surface and set up more tunnels. There's a few interesting enhancements as well, arriving from Deep Strike turn 1, a Trigon Prime 1 for a boosted damage Trigon with Synapse, already deploying 3 units, which could boost the number of things that you have in strategic reserve to make use of those tunnels. Trigons feel like they're one of the most focal and interesting datasheets of them. They're able to turn up within 6 inches, though not able to charge if they do so, and that gives you a lot of flexibility with where you put the tunnel markers down. They could just turn up at 9 inches and risk the long charge too. They do have some pretty nice general purpose damage with massive strength 9 and damage 3 attacks. Raveners are also particularly interesting here as well, being able to burrow on and off the board, returning to reserve for free, so they could be setting up tunnels all game long until they're dealt with, plus having some alright general purpose damage when they get stuck in, though best against Space Marines. Perhaps one of the most obvious things to pair with them could be any big Tyranid melee threat, things that ideally have a fair bit of damage but don't really want just to be walking up the board before they get stuck in. Maybe a Haruspex could be a particularly good example of that. Really quite big stats on these living battering rams with toughness 11 and 14 wounds, and then they've just got masters of violence and close combat, 14 attacks at strength 7, AP 1 and damage 2, plus also having another 4 attacks at strength 14 and damage d6 plus 1. That's pretty well nothing that they're not going to leave a big mark on. And they're just particularly efficient units if you can just throw them straight into melee, no questions asked. It seems that people have got quite a lot of very different takes on the Subterranean Assault list. Loads of genuinely interesting things that you could do with all those reserve shenanigans and close melee charges. I thought I'd take a look at the 2 tournament lists. This one was run by Momptitchu. who went 5-0 undefeated at a 48-player tournament. It looks like the Burrowers in this one are 2 Trigons, one with Trigon Prime and one with Synaptic Synergy. That's the 3 Rapid Ingress one. Besides them, there's just the one of the unit of Raveners for the Burrower units. I feel like most of the lists that I've seen have tended to go at least somewhat light on the Burrowers, as you don't actually need crazy amounts of tunnel markers, and the same units could potentially do it more than once if you use the command point to return them to reserve. The Raveners could do that for free, of course. Then interestingly, to back them up, there's some really big character combos. A Neuro Tyrant with a big unit of 6 Zone Throw, so they could potentially use the movement shenanigans to get line of sight on something crucial and annihilate it with buffed Warp Lancers. There's Old One-Eye leading a pair of Carnifexers, again probably the exact sort of units that you'd want to be able to deliver straight into melee via a tunnel, and points intensive enough to make it worth it. There's a Haruspex to throw at the enemy out of a tunnel as well. Interestingly, the Swarm Lord between his big melee and his command point things, seeming like he's been tempted enough to include, since his points dropped, a Maliceptor, a pair of Psychophages, which is kind of fun to see. They can debuff the enemy to amp up AP. I guess the Carnifexes and the Haruspex might like that in particular. And a Maliceptor, Biovore, and a Neurolictor to hopefully convert some Battle Shock into +1 to wound, I suppose. For another really quite different take on it, here's a list by Keo Orellana, winning a tournament called the Capital Clash in Germany 5-0. For the Burrowers, there's just a Trigon Prime and a Morlock in this one, it'd seem. The Morlock being able to do some splash mortal wounds to things nearby. Then we've got an on-foot Hive Tyrant spec'd out for melee. That one has Tremor Senses to allow you to redeploy units and put them in strategic reserve. I guess that means that you could have a whole bunch of your army there. Some objective support chaff with 10 Termagants, a Biovore, and 3 Lictors. They should be able to do a good job of a bit of area denial, objective claiming, and screening the board and doing secondaries and things while not spending much points at all. And then there's a whole bunch of big damage. There's some scary gun battery with the Exocrines and Tyrannifex, a big and mighty Norn Emissary, a Psychophage to buff damage, and sorry, there was one other Trigon there as well. There's the character one that's upgraded to a Trigon Prime, and then a regular one beyond that. This one's feeling like it's going a bit heavier on the movement things to try and draw shooting lanes. I guess lots of the army enjoying the reroll ones to hit buff, more so than the mass melee threats than the previous one seemed to have. Definitely feels like an unsettling detachment to play against though, with the sheer amount of ways that you can move models around the table and then just jump them into melee straight from the front line. Though it might be a list that suffers more if the enemy can really screen out a huge amount of the board. Next up, we've got the Vanguard Onslaught. This one's the one that is themed around the Vanguard Invaders. It gives you all your Tyranids units fall back and charge, then more importantly advance and charge for the Vanguard Invader units. That means that they can get to the action really quite quickly. And then they back it up with stratagems with a whole bunch of really helpful crafty tricks. There's a precision melee one, +1 to hit, maybe turning into a +1 to wound if they fail Battle Shock, arriving from reserves a round early, so potentially turn 1. And then 3 really standout ones, returning to reserve, which can be 2 Vanguard Invaders, so pulling units from the board and jumping potentially around behind the enemy to do secondaries and press things late game. 1 to turn off enemy shooting from greater than 18 inches away, pretty big for things like a Winged Hive Tyrant maybe. And it turns into a 6 inches for lone operatives, and that could really mess with people if they're trying to get to grips with your Lictors. And then finally there's a reactive move 6 inches, and again that can be applied to 2 Vanguard Invaders, and that's always enormously powerful whenever you have that. Best used to back away from an oncoming melee or hide behind terrain so you can't get shot, and could save a unit's life. Even easier to guarantee safety with a lone operative. Most of the enhancements are interesting enough as well. Perhaps the one where units have to test Battle Shock when they arrive from reserve on a 2+ is a particularly annoying and disruptive one, not guaranteed to do anything, but could work well with Neurolictors, and could mean that the opponent's not going to be certain that they can just drop a unit and do an action. There's a fair few Vanguard Invader units that maybe feel just a touch more tame elsewhere, but go to the next level here. Genestealers maybe feel like one of the units that's one of the stars of the show. They're 75 points per 5, they move fairly fast, they move really quite fast, and with advance and charge they can move faster. They scout 8 inches, so could be charging things turn 1 if it made sense to, though often it might make more sense to play cagier, and they get some inbuilt damage rerolls. They're often fielded alongside a Broodlord who gives them Synapse, so he'll make the Genestealers with their claws and talons all strength 5, which is just far more threatening and general purpose. He also gives them devastating wounds as well, and chips in some more general purpose attacks with Twin Links devastating wounds and damage too. It's quite common to see multiple Genestealers being led by Broodlords. They've potentially got a bit of competition from hyper-adapted Raveners. You can make the single biggest, scariest and most dangerous Vanguard Onslaught unit, with one squad of these guys attached to a regular Ravener squad. They get free rapid ingress on a big and pretty murderous damage output unit. They should be near enough guarantees to drop in and absolutely pulverise any one thing, or sustain hits and anti-monster and anti-vehicle keywords on their weapons. Basically any of the Lictor variants have massive extra value here though as well. You can go very heavy on the lone operatives between Neurolictors, regular ones and Death Leaper himself. The same kind of Lictor profile but harder to kill with 7 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save. And he again can do some battle shock shenanigans, making enemy units that are damaged have to test nearby. Perhaps a bit more standout at scrapping for the mid-board than some of them. For a couple of examples of a successful Vanguard Onslaught list, here's one by Sebastian Jeffrion, who won in around about 100 player grand tournaments, going 5-0 undefeated. This one was pre-update again, so there'll be a few changes. The Hive Tyrant will be a little cheaper, and the Raveners aren't available in 3s anymore, so you wouldn't need to make enormous changes to it. The Tyrant takes the hunting grounds, testing battle shock on a 2+, and could be a nice one to screen from shooting. There's 4 lone operatives here with Death Leaper, 1 Lictor and 2 Neurolictors. Tricky to get hold of and can make battle shock things extra punishing. 3 enormous units of Brood Lords with 10 Gene Stealers. They should have enough damage between them to take big chunks out of the enemy's mainline threats, and alongside them for 2 other massive melee threats, there's some squads of 6 Tyranid warriors with the melee bioweapons led by Winged Primes, as the Winged Primes can give them the Vanguard Invader keyword, and gives an already fairly dangerous unit a much bigger threat range with advance and charge. There's a whole bunch of Endless Multitudes, 2 units of higher objective of control, high speed Hormigons, and 1 set of Gargoyles, the Biovore with his Spore Mines, and that set of Raveners to be able to jump on and off the board, doing secondary objectives on this one, though if you wanted the same unit it would cost a bit more now. For another more recent take on a Vanguard Onslaught list, here's a list by Nathaniel Bjorger, who used it to take 3rd at the Iron Cage Summer Slam, this one going 4 wins to 1 loss. It was just interesting to see some big use of the new Tyranid Ravener datasheets here, so this one's got no less than 2 sets of the hyper-adapted Raveners, presumably each attached to a regular Ravener squad, being able to jump up rapid ingress and absolutely maul something. And then being great options for all the detachment stratagems beyond that. They can also return to reserve for free if they want. Then for another 3 big damage hammers, there's 3 Brood Lords with 3 sets of 10 Gene Stealers, so 5 enormous melee threats that the enemy units have to look out for, many of which might not be easy to catch up with as well, with things like reactive moves or turning off enemy shooting on the go. There's far more lone operatives in this one, Death Leaper leading the way, then 2 Neurolictors and 3 regular Lictors, so 6 overall, and they're going to be a nightmare to try and clear out, hiding behind terrain and then jumping on things. There's a Neurotyrant with Hunting Grounds, which could be an alright one to hold the home objective and disrupt enemies coming in, and then a Winged Hive Tyrant with Chameleonic. He could potentially use his free stratagem on the Can't Shoot Me at 8 inches one if he wanted. It definitely seems to be a detachment that's just been consistently good since the Codex came out. Next up, in a look at the detachments, we've got the Assimilation Swarm. This one's got the Feed the Swarm core rule. There's a bunch of Harvester units, the Psychophage and Haruspex, the Pyrovore and Rippers, and the Norn Assimilator. They can be used to restore wounds or restore models to nearby units, so you have a swarm that regenerates damage quite quickly. Plenty of the stratagems interact with that regeneration mechanic. There's a sticky objective one as well, which is handy. A nice revenge one: if the enemy happens to destroy a Harvester unit, then you get to have +1 to wound against them for the rest of the game. And some enhancements as well, including one to allow Harvester units to regenerate units 9 inches away, so a bit more flexibility for the core rule. Any list with these is going to likely want to go heavy on those Harvesters. Perhaps the previously mentioned Haruspex or the newly buffed Psychophage could be interesting. The Psychophage has had a bit of a glow up and is certainly seeing some play. Moving quite fast with a fairly tanky monster with 10 wounds with a 5+ fail no pain, so on average you have to chew through 15 wounds at this profile. A little bit of damage output with anti-psychic keywords, its melee is alright at chewing through Space Marines, and it gets some bonuses against injured units. It certainly seems to have been made a next level of interesting by its special rule though. It gets to mark 1 unit that's been hit by its shooting attack, for then Tyranid melee units to get extra AP against that target, and that's really quite nice with a fair amount of Tyranid melee units, many of which are AP too. It certainly looks like they're seeing some play post-update, perhaps particularly in Subterranean Assault alongside melee delivery things. Here's one example of a competitive Assimilation Swarm army list that did well. This one by Kyle Lamperez, who used it to place 6th at a tournament called Perils of the Geekery. For the Harvester units, there's 3 individual Ripper Swarms and then 3 Psychophages that can be healing things nearby, and then a bunch of nice chunky units to be able to heal. The Norn Emissary is a particularly nice target, given it's got big feel no pains and high saves, so it's hard to get those wounds off in the first place. There's a couple of Tyranofexes with acid spray this time, so they can be marching up the centre board, making the enemy have to deal with their profiles and then getting restored after. 2 Maleceptors as well, which can do kind of similar, and again are hard to take wounds off with their 4+ invulnerable save and debuffs. And between all that and the Psychophages, that's a lot of collective might and toughness on the mid board that should grind away at the enemy army. There's also old One Eye as well, again super valuable for restored wounds with a big feel no pain, and he hits hard in melee even all by himself. And a Winged Hive Tyrant with Biophagic Flow to allow healing at greater distances. I'd guess that he might play a bit cagey and hand out some stratagems, maybe taking up residence in a mid-board ruin or something. There's a bunch of objective support as well, this time with some Termagants, Neurogaunts and a Biovore. And bear in mind that this was before the Psychophage update, so in this list they would have been providing Feel No Pain, not melee damage buffs, and that does rather change their role. It might also need a little bit of wiggling for the points to fit everything in. Next up, we've got the monster detachment in the Crusher Stampede. This one's the Nidzilla list. The core rule giving your monster units either +2 OC if they're at starting strength, and then damage buffs if they go below that, starting with a +1 to hit if they're injured, and then a +1 to wound below half strength, so anything that's not quite killed will hit extra hard. The stratagems are largely supportive, the 2 damage dealer ones being a reroll hits in melee and some mortal wound impact hits on the charge. They also have a fun automatic deadly demise to throw some death throws into the enemy, and quite a useful one that allows monsters to move through terrain pieces when they move. That's really quite helpful for getting big units to function on busy boards with lots of terrain on them in 40k. I'm not the biggest fan of their enhancements though. I feel like all of them seem a bit mid for the points cost. As well as the monsters we're focused on already, it might be a nice home for the big Synapse ones that want to venture forward as well. The Maliceptor's 170 points. It perhaps feels like a side grade / upgrade on the Exocrine, getting a similar sort of style of firepower but at a closer range, having a little bit of melee threat and a 4+ invulnerable save, having the Synapse keywords to buff units nearby, and then it's a fair bit tougher to have it on the front line. That invulnerable save helps, but they can also make the enemy -1 to hit and maybe even -1 to wound nearby as well. You definitely see them stomping up the board, maybe not quite as common as the Exocrines or the Tyrannifexes, but can be helpful to have in the front ranks, particularly if you don't have quite as much Synapse there otherwise. The debuff could be genuinely annoying against melee armies as well. Otherwise, for the other friendly Synapse bugs that want to storm the midboard are the Norns. In particular, the Norn Emissary tends to be the one that gets more play. These ones are great big centerpiece models, 260 points for the Emissary, toughness 11 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable save, and then they have a bonus rule that's often used to give them OC 15 and a 5+ Feel No Pain when they take a midboard objective. That can make for just a very well secured objective that until the opponent can actually deal with the monster, they're probably not going to take too easily. And they do have some nice general purpose damage as well with a flexible Neurolance, and the damage is nice enough at strength 10, it might just struggle a bit with toughness 11 or 12. I feel like they're more commonly taken in small numbers as opposed to spams, but it's going to be hard to go too far wrong with taking one, setting its sights on a objective to hold, and then being an extra tanky focal unit for the enemy to have to deal with once they get there. In any case, here's one example of a successful Crusher Stampede winning list, this one by Kenneth Onyebor, winning a tournament called Githammer. This one's certainly pretty fully embracing a great big Tyranid monster spam army, no less than 3 of those Norn Emissaries, so you could have an enormous amount of pressure on those midboard objectives really very quickly, and while struggling to deal with the big profiles of them, they're backed up by a couple of Tyrannifexes with big hitting Rupture Cannons, 2 Exocrines for some nice anti-infantry, plus a Maliceptor handing out its debuffs, and they're all supported by a Hive Tyrant with Venom Cannon and Bone Sword, which could be handing out some free stratagems, advance and shoot and lethal hits to the Gunbugs as well. They're supported by the Biovore, 11 Neurogaunts that could help screen the backfield and potentially help with Synapse spreading, and a couple of placeholder Ripper Swarms maybe for a bit more screening. Some armies that aren't bringing enough anti-tank are certainly going to have trouble with this. Certainly feels like a big scary stat checklist, as with other armies that tend to focus more on the big individual models and damage and defensive profiles, they might tend to have a bit more success at a more casual level than grand tournaments, at least for the most part, though clearly they can win big as seen here. Finally, for the detachments I'll focus on more, I'll also mention the Synaptic Nexus as well. This one's another at least fairly generalist one, really building around the Synapse organisms, and it gives you 3 turns worth of army-wide buffs, where stuff that's near Synapse gets either a 5+ invulnerable save, a +1 to advance and charge, and a +1 to hit in melee. It generally seems to be things that support more melee things a bit more than ranged things there. For the stratagems, perhaps the real standout one is an aura of rerolls of 1 to hit and wound this phase against a marked target. That means that one Synapse creature can direct a whole bunch of firepower and have it hit very very hard against that target. There's also a nice enough Armour of Contempt equivalent as well that could be quite good for repelling assaults against a Norn Emissary, and enhancements for an extra shooting Euro Tyrant and a -1 damage one which could be nice on a Hive Tyrant to keep them good and tanky. The Synaptic Nexus was a bit more popular previously. It doesn't tend to be seen quite as much on the tournament scene recently, but here's one example of a list from a little while back, played by a Manic Gudimani, who used it to take second at a tournament called Showdown at Frogtown. It's led by a Hive Tyrant with Synaptic Control for the -1 damage thing, and as you'd expect there's a huge amount of Synapse units in the list, a Norn Emissary and 2 Maliceptors as big tanky things to take the midboard, and then no less than 3 units of 3 Zoanthropes. If they were all working together and focusing fire on one target with those rerolls, there's not a lot that's going to get in the way of that Psychic Choir. As well as that, there's also Old One Eye as well. Looks like he's being used as a melee bruiser run independently, A couple of Exocrines that will be quite nice to run alongside that Hive Tyrant with his buffs, and for objective support some skirmishing Gargoyles, a single Biovore, and a couple of Neurolictors. I guess the Battle Shocks could be fun in combination with that Mortal Wound on a failed test one. Feels like maybe some of the damage and defensive ones could be some of the most important stratagems here, and the big turn of +1 to hit in melee could be handy enough when a bunch of the melee things are engaged in this one. Finally, for the Tyranid detachments, that just leaves us with 2. These ones a bit lesser played. The Unending Swarm is the one that really focuses on the Endless Multitude, so Termagants and Hormagaunts and the like, the core rule being a surge move mechanic, and having a bunch of stratagems that help them out. It is considered pretty heavily overshadowed versus the others. If you wanted to run massive horde Tyranids, I think you'd be tempted by Invasion Fleet with the damage buffs that you can get there, plus the good regeneration for the swarms, and that feel no pain stratagem don't hurt. It was maybe a bit of a shame for this one. It got nerfed quite a bit, both limiting the respawn stratagem and their surge moves getting less powerful. Otherwise, there's the Grotmus one, the Warrior Bioform Onslaught. That gives the warriors a 5+ invulnerable save and OC3, plus a bunch of stratagems that focus around them. It feels like maybe the most obvious thing is to go pretty heavy on the melee warriors, though I have seen some more unusual lists take ranged warriors and use it to support some other datasheets with stratagems. In general though, if you want to run this one more or less as intended, you kind of need a vast amount of warriors to make it even particularly worth it. And again, it's probably a side grade versus a direct upgrade versus running Invasion Fleet with access to some very easy damage and defensive stratagems and other good stuff. Finally, I'll just round up a few of the datasheets that we hadn't gone through individually with just a few lines on each. Eurogaunts are super cheap chaff that are pretty reasonable enough to screen the backfield or be expendable units as cannon fodder and secondary things. They do have lots of rivals. Termagants often get overshadowed by Hormagaunts or Gargoyles for the OC2 chaff. They do have some damage output with Spine Fist if you want them though, and their reactive move rule occasionally could matter big. I talked a bit about the melee warriors, though the ranged ones tend to be a bit on the niche side. They are a nice cheap Synapse unit that do have a bit of damage and defensive threats that could work against sort of medium infantry. There's a fair few things in that sort of point and weight brackets that might well be more useful, things like Endless Multitudes or the Lictors. The Winged Prime could be interesting to give the Vanguard keywords to the melee warriors. That feels like the single best draw to him, though he doesn't have particularly enormous damage or defensive stats. His buff is okay, but not crazy, I'd say. Tyrant Guard could be run alongside Hive Tyrants, though people often tend to run them individually. The Tyrant Guard do have legitimately good defense for the stats, though. I feel like they're perhaps a touch underrated for making a Tyrant particularly annoying to deal with, though often you can just hide them. Von Ryan's Leapers again are better in Vanguard, though often get overshadowed by the Lictors, the Gene Stealers, and potentially the Raveners now. Definitely seem usable enough as cheap infiltrating skirmish infantry though I feel like most would probably take regular Lictors in their place as a first choice. And Venom Throats can provide some aura of cover and stealth to nearby units. Again, not too bad, but maybe seen as a bit of a luxury. A lot of the Tyranids infantry units, where the stealth could matter in a big way for, just aren't particularly tough anyway, and it might not save them, and you don't really want them out and about taking damage. Zone Ropes do certainly crop up in a few competitive lists, as we've seen, maybe most commonly in a 6-block squad led by a Neuro Tyrant for the big buffs that it can give them. They are kind of pricey and fairly fragile though, for the damage that they do. Pyrovores could be cheapish placeholder units at just 40 points, having a little bit of threat against enemies that get too close, and they could be a Harvester keyword unit for the Assimilation Swarm. Hive Guard are looking a bit more interesting after a points drop. They are notably tanky for the points cost and do have some alright general purpose firepower with things like shot cannons, with their damage output being a bit on the weak side though. I feel like they struggle to compete too well. Barb Gaunts could be interesting for a small unit to debuff enemy infantry movement. I likely wouldn't go heavy on them, but occasionally their debuff could be really nice to keep a big punchy and slow melee unit out of the game. Rippers can be super cheap placeholder units that could deep strike. They don't really have any threat though, and OC0 means they can't do certain actions and things. It may feel a bit hard to justify them versus Spore Mine spawned from a Biovore for what they'd want to do. They could have some more interest in the Assimilation Swarm where they can heal nearby things as a big extra bit of utility. Spore Mines and the Mucilid Spore just feel like they're priced as sort of placeholder data sheets where you'd not actually want to take them, but instead spawn them in with stuff. They're just far too expensive for what they do really. And the Parasite of Mortrex is another option for a lone operative. It can move quite fast and has some fun tricks with spawning Rippers about. Though I feel like all three of the more regular Lictor datasheets tend to outcompete them for the current points costs. I think it's one of the Tyranid units that could do with going down in price. Next up, we've got Carnifexes and Old One Eye. I feel like the standard Carnifex has some disappointing stats for the cost, just a fair bit less damage than you might hope for. I generally want to run them only if running Old One Eye, as we've seen someone's been recently using them, it being delivered by the tunnels in the Subterranean Assault. With Old One Eye's big hitting buffs, then their damage gets far more worth it. They can be a big Death Star unit that can be really efficient to use stratagems on if so. The Screamer Killer still maybe feels a bit on the pricey side For a big chunky main damage dealer with a bunch of damage 3 attacks, it could certainly make a mess of some Terminator equivalents if it can get into them, that might well have to move around terrain and things to do so. The Tyranid flyers in the Harpy and the Hive Crone are overcosted, as with most aircraft out there. Games Workshop really doesn't seem to want them as part of any sort of strong list, and the Swarm Lord I think got at least a fair bit more interesting, dropping down in cost recently. He does have at least some fairly punchy melee profiles, and gets you generated command points and debuffing enemy command points nearby, both of which could be really quite helpful and disruptive. Still probably a second choice versus Hive Tyrants for most people, but he certainly gained a fair bit of ground on them, given that he went down in cost quite a lot without any sort of rules debuff, whereas the Hive Tyrants lost half their stratagems recently. The Morlock's the counterpart of the Trigon that can turn up and deal some mortal wound damage to things nearby. It's quite a fun rule and does look like some people have been using them in the Subterranean Assault with the Borrower keyword. I still say they're probably not quite as interesting as the Trigons though, particularly with the damage 3 attacks that the Trigons can threaten later on. It seems certainly more people are taking Trigons versus Morlocks in that detachment. The Tyranids is the fleshy Tyranid drop pod that can deep strike things in turn 1. It pays a premium for doing so, and is maybe most let down by not really having a clear transport choice that really wants to get super close and pay a big premium to do so. The Spore Assist is the fortification that, as usual for 10th edition, costs far too much for what it does. It could spawn some Mucolids about though, which has some fun factor. Ultimately feels like it's doing far worse by of all things though for 145 points. The Tervigon is the Brood Mother that can regenerate Termagant squads. Maybe a bit over-dependent on big squads of Termagants being the way to go. To be worth it in themselves, you do get quite a lot of stats for the points though, and they can make the swarms punch up a bit with some lethal hits. Not one that sees lots of competitive play, though can do alright in more casual games. And then finally there's the great big Harridan and Hierophant, the Tyranid Titanic unit swooping around with some dire biocannons, generally priced to the point where they're going to be a bit niche compared with other Tyranid units. I feel like that's Games Workshop's intention with those massive units out there, though again not unplayable casually. In any case though, let me know your thoughts on the Tyranids in 40k right now, what's been working on the tabletop for you, and which of the detachments are you most tempted to play currently. I look forward to hearing all your thoughts and ideas down in the comments below. Feel free to let me know any other fun Tyranids tactics or insights as well. I certainly look forward to hearing any other major things I might have missed. As mentioned earlier, a big thank you to ObjectiveMarkers.com for sponsoring the video. If you like some fun themed faction objectives, then feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. They ship within the UK at the moment, and have a bunch of ones that are themed to all manner of different factions, all on their clear silicon mats so you can see the battlefield under them. A big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave this one there for now though. Subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming with new ones out just about every day. And if you'd like to help support the channel, I'll just mention that Auspex Tactics also has a Patreon page that's linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons certainly get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.